Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Ariel Greenwood and Jonathan Gay. And I think I'm going to pass off hosting duties to Ariel. But first, Ariel, I want you to introduce yourself, your work, and talk about what inspired you to organize this conversation today.
Deal. Okay. Thanks, Jason. I'm Ariel. I live in South Central Montana half the year, and I live and work in New Mexico the other half the year. My work is mostly around land management and cattle management. So I'm sort of a hired manager of livestock in both states. My husband Sam and I have an LLC called Grass Nomads LLC that we use sort of to encapsulate all of our land and livestock management work. So we're pretty focused around progressive land management, progressive grazing, trying to improve the range while making a living and a livelihood. And I've been doing that for a few years now. I started working in agriculture in my teens. I think it was about 17, kind of smaller scale farming in North Carolina, where I'm from, and then gradually migrated west to California, as one does, and started working with livestock there. And after a few years, I actually worked for John Gay for, what was that, maybe a year or so, I think, as a grazing manager for his ranch. And so that's how I got familiar with John. And I've been very inspired by the work that he's doing on the land, in particular with a lot of the stream restoration kind of stuff that he's doing. And a lot of that has been, stuff that I witnessed while I was working there, often just kind of on the sidelines, and has become a lot more meaningful to me in the years since, because I really starting to understand that while we can manage the pasture and the range progressively, a lot of the ecological function that a landscape has to offer and perform is actually going to be in those smaller wetlands, which might comprise a really small percent of any given landscape, but contribute a tremendous amount ecologically and culturally. So I wish that I'd spent more time helping John on some of those projects to see what all he'd learned, and I'm hoping we can tap into some of that here in this conversation. And also, I hope that we can talk a little bit about some of the more systemic barriers to doing, I'd say, larger scale wetland restoration, especially on working landscapes, because that's the landscape I'm in. I'm in a cattle context, often a commodity cattle context. That's just the niche that I found to make a living and feel like I'm doing my part. And that is a context that I think often gets ignored or left out of a lot of the ecological conversations and rewilding conversations or regenerative ag conversations. And John is perfectly in position to speak to those barriers as someone who has run up against them at various times. So with that being said, John, I would invite you to give maybe a little bit of an intro into how you got involved in land management and raising cattle, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on. I had a background in tech and decided I wanted to, get back out onto the land, and bought a ranch, and quickly was told, oh, you got to graze it. You got to have agriculture. I'm really more of a plant person, but the cows really do play an important role on the landscape. And so we've had our home ranch for about 16 years now, and had cows almost all that time, and kind of gradually learning and, shifting our understanding of land management and how the ecosystem here works.
Thanks. So just that very statement you made, that cows can play a role in the landscape. Could you expound a little bit on that, and to whatever extent you're comfortable, maybe give any listeners a little bit more details about where you are, at least ecologically, what that kind of historical landscape is like, and what it is like today?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really drives me on the landscape, has been sort of two questions. One is, what did the native people eat? What was how do you live? I always thought it's unfair that a cow can go out in the pasture and just have a meal and I can't. And so that actually leads to lots of questions around ecological function and what the role of the cow is. And then the other question that really drives me is, what Arrow was talking about is really the function of the watershed and the creeks. And there's a lot of dysfunction on almost all the lands here in California and really all over the world. And it's really hard to learn and understand what it might have looked like and what we might be able to do about it.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the historical, just kind of brass tacks facts about how people lived until maybe the early 19th century there are just kind of hard to come by, just kind of hard to find that information?
Yeah, really the key thing is just the pre-span here in California. I'm in West Sonoma County in California. There's really nobody has a good idea of what the people looked like and how they treated the landscape before the Spanish came here, and before the disease that preceded the Spanish came. So as far as cows have this ecological function. I think a lot about megafauna and what they do, and so for us, the cows serve to both preserve the grasslands, keep it from being taken over by shrubs and trees, but also to cycle the nutrients and things. But in a historical context, the cows actually for the Spanish serve the function of destroying all the native food crops. And so it's sort of interesting is me being very interested in native food crops and what people ate, but also running cattle, which is really the thing that destroyed it. Here in California, when we were growing up, they always Native Americans ate acorns. And, I looked at it, the oak trees, and wow, that's really a lot of work. And how do you store a year's worth of acorns? It just didn't really add up. Sure, they ate them, but, couldn't have been the only thing. But it's just about the only thing that the Spanish cattle didn't destroy. And so probably, I think that's the kind of shift is when the, Spanish came, or the settlers came, after the Spanish, so Native Americans eat acorns because that was kind of what they had left.
Mm-hmm. That kind of revisionist history, I think, probably runs rampant in our historical accounts, and even including what we say about what cattle eat or don't eat, or what wildlife eats and doesn't eat. It's often starting from a degraded landscape, and so then that becomes our updated reference point by which we make decisions. And so it seems like you're trying to, through, I'm assuming, a lot of just kind of trawling academic papers and also a lot of super hands-on experience, trying to find and sometimes maybe just infer what the sort of foodscape was before the introduction of those kind of rangy Spanish cattle, which really weren't even being raised for meat that much early on, right?
Yeah, it was tallow and hides, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a background in tech and, sort of software. And there's this idea of reverse engineering. It's like, you have this system running, you want to understand how it works. You don't have the person who created it to talk to, and you don't have the manual or anything. So you basically, got to go in and sort of reverse engineer it. And really, that's kind of the way I approach the question of how these landscapes work and what people ate is, it's even hard to, you identify a plant, like, well, is this a food plant or not? I spent, years thinking, oh, lupins are toxic. And then finally, just in the last couple of years, I actually, if you leach them, they're a bean, and the seeds are, were an important human food, and they still eat them in Italy. But just the idea that, anybody who's like a native plant aficionado or, interested in native plants in California, the vast majority of it, lupins are toxic to humans, but they're actually a food. And, that's the kind of thing where you really got to dig deep and sort of make some assumptions and sort of assume that the natives were smart. If there was a food here that was edible, they were probably eating it, and they were probably tending it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, I kind of want to broaden out a little bit, just to kind of explore some broader context. So, I mean, there seems to be, when you talk about like environmentalism in general, there seems to be kind of two major strands that are kind of opposed to each other. And one, I think, is currently best represented by someone like George Monbiot, right, who just wrote this book, Regenesis, who advocates rewilding, but he also, from my understanding, looks down on agriculture, especially, animal, ruminant agriculture. But he seems to want to basically grow most of our food in a vat, based on my understanding, and get people off the land and, and then rewild. And then there's the other, so it's kind of like this, that one vision is kind of like a binary vision of like humans are bad for the land. We need to crowd them in cities, and we need to use technology to support their, livelihoods and somehow mitigate the externalities or whatever. I don't
land sparing. I've heard that characterized as.
And then the other one is, as I think what both of you more advocate of, that humans need to interact with the landscape. That humans have been, we evolved as land managers, and we, in order to protect or in order not to destroy the ecology, we have to be intimate with the ecology. We have to interact with it. We have to understand, how the watershed works. We have to understand, all the various flows. And I don't know if either of you want to speak to kind of this tension you see. Even when we talk about climate change, people talk about, oh, cows are, horrible for the climate because of the methane, and often, they're referring to like industrial, factory farming, right? CAFOs and things of that nature when they're citing their numbers. But there's, there's other ways to raise ruminants that, are good for the carbon cycle and water cycle and all these things. So if you want to, I don't know if either of you want to comment on this larger kind of, ideological tension, I guess.
I hate the term rewilding. I have to admit, I just think it's just not accurate. It's colonialism at work. So one of the things I like to go, look as far back as we can in understanding this, and animals and plants and ecosystems, they work together. And here in California, most of the megafauna, the big animals, were, went extinct 10,000 years ago, and people debate, what caused it, and, was it hunting or was it, climate change? I have kind of a pet theory that actually, if you look at the food plants, the overlap between mammoths and humans in terms of the habitat and the foods they eat is actually pretty huge. And they were actually, humans would have competed with, mammoths for food and habitat in these riparian zones. So, maybe they, maybe that was the reason. But anyway, the key thing is there's really important ecological function that large animals play, and they've basically been removed from the landscape here in California to a huge degree. And humans stepped in and took that role for 10,000 years, and then we removed the humans. Mm-hmm. And now we have cattle, and that's the only thing we have. And so that's why we use cattle. That's the tool we have, and it's a pretty imperfect tool, but it's an important tool.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak more, John, to that point you just made? Because I think in a regenerative grazing space that you and I have at least a toe in some of the time, there is a bit of a pendulum swing with people almost advocating the cow as the tool to solve any environmental problem. Yep. Personally, I work with thousands of animals in the course of the year. That's my job. I'm very pro bovine within the right context. So all that to say, personally, I don't think cattle belong everywhere, because it just doesn't make sense that they would. This country, or North America at least, has a range of ecosystems with quite a complex history relative to large animals, as you alluded to. What are some of the ways, let's just say on your particular land base or land bases, what are the ways in which cattle facilitate your goals, which you have to really mitigate them? Where do they fit in, and where do they not fit in relative to what your aim is for your landscape?
Yeah, I mean, the two key things they do are cycle the, dead grasses back, into the soil, and, break down the thatch, and, help, maintain plant diversity. And they also, help prevent brush encroachment, although they're pretty imperfect at preventing brush encroachment in our context. We have a coyote bush that really is just, displacing a lot of our grasslands, and it's a challenge. Lost the thread, but.
Well, like for example, there's some places you fence cattle out of where you only allow them to access selectively certain times a year, certain density. Can you speak a little bit more to those details and how you found they fit relative to the wetland projects you have, for example?
Yeah, and I think our goal, some of my key goals are to, restore some of the native food plants, and in particular grasses and wildflowers were really important native food plants. They, ate the seeds of the grasses and the wildflowers. They ate greens out of the field, clovers and milkmaids and other plants. Having cattle graze that in the growing season is generally very destructive to most of the, native food crops. Having them graze it when it's dry and dormant is actually pretty positive. It's hard to know what the 10,000 year ago pattern is, but it seems like the native pattern here was you let the plants grow in the spring, and then you burn every year, every few years, depending on the context. And so the cattle for us, to some extent, play the role of fire. I suspect that role of fire that Native Americans used was actually replacing the historic megafauna impact of, there were elk and mammoth. Mammoth would have done an amazing job at keeping the brush and the trees and maintaining the grasslands. Maybe not so much at cycling grasses, but to some degree. And they would come through once a year, probably, a particular place. And so the plants in California evolved with grazing once a year, maybe, or maybe even every few years. To at least heavy impact grazing it is my suspicion. But if you're running a commercial cattle ranch, you got to run the cattle through multiple times a year. It's pretty hard on the native plants. So we keep the cows generally out of the riparian areas, almost completely. I mean, there is some argument for letting cows in riparian areas, but we generally don't, unless it's dry. And we also sort of select particular areas of the ranch where, okay, this is a area that has a good native plant population, and we're just going to only graze this, typically once or twice a year, but when everything's dormant. And that's really what seems to help the native plants do best at recovering.
One interesting anecdote on the megafauna front is when I was working at Freestone, we actually found a really cool rubbing rock that was like glossy, smooth, a little bit above the soil surface, a few feet above. And we invited out Breck Parkman, who was a retired state archaeologist, I think. He developed the La Brea tar pit theory. Basically, he is a principal proponent of a lot of the ideas that we have about megafauna in California and even in North America, and discovered some really large rubbing rocks nearby there. So we had him out, and he said, if memory served, John, a fair degree of certainty, like 90% confidence, I think that those were end of the Pleistocene era rubbing rocks from very large mammals, so mastodon, mammoth, etc. And so these are animals that would have migrated towards the coast. Would that have been in the middle of summer when it was getting really hot in the Central Valley? I'm trying to remember the season.
Yeah, I think they would. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And of course, at that time, I think, if memory serves, the coast actually extended something like 10 or 12 miles further west into the ocean, because there was more ice at the time. It was, I guess, towards the end of that last ice age. So that whole area was and is coastal prairie, and many of those species, plant species and animal species, evolved in fairly open landscapes, with obviously that pressure from the brush on the sort of aridity scale or brittleness scale. It would trend towards brush with no impact or grazing or fire, as opposed to desert with no grazing or fire impact, is the case in places where I work sometimes. But yeah, if you have animals that are just one, in the case of cattle, just kind of reminiscent of one species out of dozens of large animals that would have interacted with the brush and woody plants in all these different ways, including having a trunk to just rip them out from the roots, I would imagine it is a pretty crude tool. And I know that you have wrestled a lot with how to raise cattle. In your case, if your marketing is grass-fed beef in an area that makes a lot of its money from wine grapes, wine and weed. It's a wine and weed economy around there. And felt some frustration that even though cattle are an imperfect tool, I think you're using them to really enhance your land to far beyond what a lot are able to do. And yet still, it seems like most people in this sort of foodie hub still don't really value some of the stories you're able to tell about the cattle and how they're raised and the role that they play. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the difference between, there's at least a 10x difference between cheap wine and expensive wine. And there's, hardly any difference in price between, feedlot beef and grass-fed beef, or local, sustainably raised beef. And it's tough too, in the grass-fed beef market. It turns out there's a lot of grass-fed beef in California if you just go to auction and, buy the old cows. And so it's tough for people who are really trying to, like us, trying to raise the cow for its entire life with a particular system, to compete with those prices. And it really doesn't seem like, you just taking good care of the land is not a social status signifier in our culture here. Mm-hmm. It's having a fancy house or having a fancy car or drinking the right wine, or those are social status signifiers, but actually taking care of the land is not. And that's part of the problem with rewilding is the dominant social message is something like, 30 by 30, where there's this kind of global agenda, protect 30% of the land by 2030. And protect it means get the people off it and just let nature take its course. But nature taking its course without the animals that used to create disturbance and spread seeds and is not a healthy landscape. I mean, it's kind of neat from some of the plants here. We have a buckeye tree, which has a giant seed, one of the biggest tree nuts. And you ask a botanist or anybody, like, well, what's the function of the seed? What was it? What did it feed? What animals spread the seed? And everybody will shrug and say, I don't know. It doesn't. It's not a question you can ask. And I suspect a mammoth probably would, have liked seeds and pooped them out, or maybe a ground sloth or something. But you just don't know the answer. There's lots of roots that the Native Americans ate, and these, lilies and other edible roots are dependent on digging animals to create soil disturbance, break up the bulbs, and create seed beds, and prevent competition. And before there were probably peccaries, pig relatives here that would have done that job, and maybe a mammoth would have dug them up, and then people did it for 10,000 years, and now nobody's doing it. So these plants are, particularly with climate change, on the road to going extinct, because they just don't have their, animal partner. And it's not something that our culture is really willing to acknowledge, that humans and, other animals before humans play these important roles in the ecosystem.
It's interesting because it seems to me that as soon as you start to talk about the pure function, even just the caloric function of wild plants, for example, or the value of domestic ruminant protein, etc., a lot of people very quickly jump to the talking point that is saying, well, if you're speaking of it only in its purely functional, caloric, or nutritional terms, you're commodifying nature, and that's bad. And it just strikes me that our relationship, that sort of tending and interacting and benign to beneficial disturbance relationship that we had with nature that brought us to be who we are today, just as people alive in the world. Our relationship to that paradigm is so broken that it's almost like the new paradigm is, as you articulated, Jason, one of not touching and leaving alone, because we don't trust ourselves to have any kind of skillful impact or interaction with nature anymore. And as soon as you start talking about, for example, the need for selective thinning to keep forests healthy, a lot of environmental groups will start filing lawsuits because they say that's just shilling for the timber industry, you know? So there's got to be a way to convey the value of what you're describing, that active observational tending that has a consumptive aspect to it, where you are reaping what you're sowing. That doesn't immediately trip people's concerns about commodifying nature. But I have not honestly found a very good way to do that yet. It almost has to be demonstrated more than talked about, it seems.
Yeah, I've been super frustrated because I thought, oh, we just need good examples of, how humans interacted with the landscape and the kinds of important roles they played. And, I've come up, over the, 16 years here, I feel like I've found some good examples, and it's surprising the resistance to even looking at it or talking about them. Like here in California, the salmon are, in the process of going extinct, all the salmonid fish. And, I talked to a salmon expert, in Alaska a year ago, and he's like, yeah, I think the fish in California are probably going to be extinct in a few years. Hopefully that's not true, but it is that bad. And it turns out in our area, there were a series of very large shallow lakes. There's one called Tole Lake, which is a 1,000-acre shallow lake. And there's a 3,000-year history of humans putting artifacts in this shallow lake. There was another one in Round Valley in Mendocino County. It was 7,000 acres. And the Tole Lake, if you read on Wikipedia, it's like, oh, it was created by a natural earthen barrier at the outflow to the valley. I mean, it's just nonsensical, right? And first off, shallow lakes probably wouldn't last for 3,000 years, right? They fill in with sediment as the plants grow, and they turn into a wet meadow. And second of all, there's this is not like steep mountains, right? Natural earthen barriers don't form, right? They need some mechanism. And so almost certainly, humans built a dam with, plants, and it's kind of beautiful. I think actually you could grow the dam, right? There's a spring right here where the dam is, and you plant the right willows and cattails, and you dump an inch of dirt every year. Pretty soon you got a 20-foot deep lake behind it. They've picked the right thing. And there was 5 or 6 of them. And you imagine just these lakes would trickle out water and create fish habitat, and they would, the fish, if the fish could get into them, the young fish, it would be amazing, habitat, and red-legged frogs and all these things. But, we can't talk about it because you can't talk about humans, having a healthy relationship with the landscape. And, we'd rather let the fish, die than even look at it. And it's pretty disheartening to me. Particularly it's called Tole Lake. It's a county park. The county owns it. I could go out with a bulldozer and excavator in 2 days, restore 80% of the function of this lake. It's just that easy. But, they'll spend, decades thinking about it, and millions of dollars thinking about it. And,
yeah. And you would spend decades in prison if you were to do that kind of guerrilla engineering
yeah.
a couple nights. So that when you say we can't talk about it, or those conversations that just kind of go nowhere that you try to have, are you ever finding people attributing the loss of species and the loss of habitat to climate change point blank, and just not engaging the land management piece? Because that's something I'm seeing a lot, is people just say, well, that's climate change, and then kind of wash their hands of any of the more granular aspects that contribute to climate change and kind of mediate it in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's even worse because I don't really hear hardly anybody mourning the loss of these species. I mean, they're not even hardly, talking about that, even the loss. Um, so yeah, like when I've tried to engage the local watershed experts on, it'd be interesting to talk about this totally like thing. I'd love to have a conversation. The response is, oh, I'm sure the Native Americans had lots of tricks, and the email thread ends.
Mm-hmm.
It's, and I think we're also constrained by our economic constraints. It's hard to explore some of these things. I think the all the funding mechanisms through the government or foundations, I mean, they don't really support the idea of learning about how these things function. Another great example is springs. I like, I grew up in San Diego and I had no idea, where fresh water came from in the summer, and sort of learn, oh, there's places where the drinking water just comes out of the ground. Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've asked a number of people, like, well, what do you think the Native Americans, how did they manage springs? And, even a very progressive permaculture expert said, I think the Grizzlies did it. I'm like, really? 3,000 years people were here and, drinking water is absolutely critical. You don't think maybe they put some rocks or sticks to keep the water fresh, or maybe they dug a hole to swim in at the outflow, or maybe they were growing some, creek monkey flower, which is an edible green, to have some greens throughout the summer by this spring. It's like, no, the Grizzlies did it.
It's implying that they dug it out, that they dug out the spring to kind of, what was he implying the Grizzlies did exactly?
Oh yeah, the Grizzlies, I mean, lots of animals. I mean, donkeys dig out springs and elephants dig out springs. They find a wet spot and they dig a hole to get drinking water. So yeah, the Grizzlies would have done that same thing. I mean, it's like everybody but humans, every large animal except humans, modifies springs to meet their needs.
Yeah, it is a preposterous idea that we were not intimately involved with manipulating water. And a couple days ago, I had some friends out visiting, actually from California, and we were on one of the ranches that we run up here. And there's a spot that's sort of basically a stream, but it's fed by irrigation water that kind of dumps out. So it's cut, at this point, it's cut, fairly channelized, relatively steep grade that won't really meander because there's not enough just structural material there. And I've been kind of playing around with how I graze it and how the animals impact it. But I've been kind of in my own time chipping away at putting in little small beaver dam analogs, little baby BDAs, just to get some structure in there, slow down the water, and maybe pull it up a little bit. And so these friends are helping me. And one of them, Emma, is an outdoor educator and works with kids. And she was building a really good dam. I was like, that's an impressive dam. You really got your technique down, because it takes a lot of technique, actually. And she said, well, I build and I take down a lot of dams. And I asked her what she meant. And she said she works with kids. And the kids she worked with are just, anytime they're around water, obsessed with damming it up if it's flowing, or accelerating it if it's dammed up. So she has to kind of respond and undo what they did. But it just struck me that, I mean, I was that way as a kid, and I'm obviously that way now. The joy of throwing one's just kind of mammalian weight around and manipulating water it's an immediate joy. It's an immediate feedback loop. You feel like you are significant. You feel like you have agency because you are influencing your environment. You're sending water to places where it wasn't before. And if you grew up in a culture where you understood that if you send water over onto those reeds over there, in 3 to 5 days, they're going to start sending up new shoots or new roots. Of course, that had to have been part of the culture. And yet, why do you think it sounds like a lot of that has fallen away from the historical record? Is that just what you're finding?
Yeah, actually, I think that a functioning human relationship with nature is a competitor of capitalism and really not to be tolerated in our culture. It's like, if you can get what you need from nature, you don't need the grocery store. And obviously, we're so far from that. It seemed ludicrous to me that we would, have taboos to, sort of protect that. But that really seems what's going on. I thought, oh, we obviously I can't live without a grocery store. I mean, why would it matter if I restore a creek? But it seems like there really is some strong energy against it. And I've sort of, when we first came to the ranch, the creeks on the ranch are incised, and we had a bunch of, experts out to like talk about grants and learn about ranch management. And, I'm like, well, why are the creeks incised? And, these people who are professional stream restoration people, I don't know, maybe it's the cattle, maybe it's climate. We really don't know. What do you mean you don't know? It's not your job. Maybe we should figure it out, so sometimes okay, I'm going to figure it out. So I spent, 10, 12 years like, okay, really, what did it look like? Well, what's the difference? And, I've got a thesis, and it'd be great to, have people to collaborate with, but haven't found it. But really, there's our creeks are in three states. One is they're, eroded and incised, bare dirt, and it just, digs down. The other is, the conventional restoration is plant a bunch of willows, and that tends to stabilize it, but doesn't really build up the soil again. And then the third state, which I'm trying for, is a mix of willows and sedges and grasses and things, basically mat forming roots with lots of stems that'll actually capture sediment and build soil. There's creeks on the ranch where you can stand in the bottom of the creek and you're standing on bedrock, and you look above your head, and 20 feet above your head is where the topsoil used to be, and it's very clear. It's just this V, and it's really fascinating because actually, if you look at the valley, there's a V, of the hill straight down to the bedrock you're standing on, and then clearly, there's the V, and then the soil formed above it, and like it's absolutely critical to our existence. Is like, how did those valley soils form? Because that's where we get most of our food from. Mm-hmm. And you talk to a stream restoration, stream expert, and like they don't have the answer. They can't tell you. There's some new, the latest thing is a stream evolution theory, and like it's kind of neat, but they forgot to include the animals and the plants in the theory.
The people too.
Yeah, well, people are animals, so I
fair enough
together. Yeah. But yes, the people are critical, and so clearly on our land, the mountain, the hills came out of the ocean, with the ice age, and you eroded these things. Everything was bare, and then some force caused topsoil to form in the valleys, and it'd be really interesting to know what that was, so we could do it again. But it's something that you're not allowed to talk about. Said, maybe a willow, he mentioned to a stream restoration professional, maybe a willow thicket's not the best pattern, and his answer is, I like kind of a mixture of willows and sedges, and his answer is, I like willow thickets, and you stomp off, annoyed.
Man, it's so weird because I've observed the same thing here in Montana. We have lots of willow. It's in New Mexico. If I plant it, I have to fence it out that day, or all the elk and antelope immediately march and strip the cambium layer off. Here in Montana, it's very different in about every way, but it's much less brittle, and stuff just grows. And I've actually found that cattle, depending on how I graze them, these are herds from about 350 to up to 1,300 animals at a time. So density, timing, duration, how much of the stream they're drinking from, what are alternate sources, those all really mediate how they interact with the stream structure. But I've actually found that in some ways they can propagate willow, or at least coppice it the way that beaver do, and cause more new younger shoots. And in some ways that's cool, because then the elk really like to hang out there because there's lots of new green shoots, and that's where they have their babies. There's lots of protein. At the same time, it's so delicate, right? Because if you have this force that's just coppicing willow, and the willow are spreading and taking over those wet areas in between, those kind of gaps, you lose that complex matrix of plants. Yet anyone driving by might think, oh, look at all that willow, it looks great. But people talk about willow as being stream bank stabilizers, and they are to a degree, but I've also been in lots of willow like monocultures where the water was just eroding right around the roots, and it was so shaded out, nothing else could really grow. So it sounds like you're coming in and trying to selectively thin to get more light and to get more spaces in between the trees. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, there's a particular species of willow on the ranch, Arroyo Willow. And it's really, back to the mammoth thing. It's if you take a twig of this willow and you pull on it, a smaller twig, it just snaps off really cleanly at the base. There's an abscission layer, and that's an adaptation to being, eaten by mammoths, right? Is these willows just, they're very grass-like. They want to be eaten. They want to be disturbed. They want to be knocked over and get to reroot. They can't have too much of it, but it's a key ecological function that's gone, is what's the animal that, thins and breaks the willows other than beaver. It's great to see the energy behind that. But yeah, my focus is really like the more cattails and sedges and grasses I can get growing in these creeks, the better. It was kind of a revelation to me to think, when I started, I'm like, do cattails grow in creeks? I don't know. I've never seen it. Can they grow in a seasonal creek? I don't know. Well, it turns out they can, and they do, and they're adapted to it. But just the livestock is just removed them everywhere. But it's also been sort of sobering to realize that these willow, or not the willow, the sedge, there's a particular sedge, a tule, which was a big sedge, a super important food crop. Eat the root, eat the pollen, build houses out of the stems. Same with the cattails. Almost so many of the wetland plants are actually edible. But planting a patch of cattails or tules it's a lot like planting a tree, because it takes a really long time. Once they get established and all this energy stored in these roots, they're a pretty rugged thing, that can be destroyed by, cattle coming back 6 times in a year, but they're certainly fine with once a year. But it really takes years to, establish this store of energy. It's like it takes years to grow a big tree, and it's kind of sobering.
It's interesting, the biases, I think, in some of the rewilding movement there's a lot of excitement in some of the United Kingdom, I think, about removing some of the intense grazing pressure that has come to characterize a lot of those green hills where, again, with the shifting baseline, we just think, oh, those are windswept prairies, they never grow anything. And actually, if you plan grazing a little more strategically and change the time of use, or maybe remove animals for a few years and let it rest and recover, you start to see all these different plants express. But I've started to think, I wonder if some of these places left relatively untouched by grazing animals 20 years from now will start to realize that actually they did need some of that disturbance, just like we do need here in North America. And the interesting thing about shrub encroachment is that it happens fast, but it also happens slow. It happens so slow we don't notice it year to year. But then with the hindsight of a couple decades, those plants are so established and so big, it's really hard to knock them back or remove them once they get to that degree. And like in New Mexico, the corollary there would be the juniper and pinon, where they're important, they're native, they belong, just like the coyote bush you mentioned, but they evolved with these checks and balances that keep them from taking over. And we've, as you say, removed the people component. And it's almost as if it's embarrassing. Within academia, it's almost as if the vibe I kind of pick up on is there's no room for speculation. Like it's somehow inappropriate to speculate about what the relationship people used to have was. So we just stick to the facts, but the observational data we can gather is in a degraded and very recently degraded ecosystem. So the story we keep repeating is just a small recent slice of what the whole used to be. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And as I've tried to reverse engineer, what did the ecosystem look like and what were the forces that shaped it? One of the things that's really struck me the most is just how most of the California native plants are human edible. There's like it's constantly like, oh, is this plant edible? I don't know. You look it up. Oh, turns out it is.
That's extraordinary, actually, that's true. That's pretty amazing.
And it's even more extraordinary is like you have all these, doomer debates of like, how many people can the planet feed? And we have this incredibly narrow thing of, like I like cattle, they play an important role. But, the cattle people say, well, you got to have cattle because there's nothing, you can't grow food on a hill, a rocky hill, or, these places. Well, it's not true. You can grow human edible food anywhere, because at least in California, because you can't, any place, a rocky hill grow, wildflowers with edible seeds or edible bulbs. A wetland grows, edible bulbs and roots and edible pollen. Savannah Hills grows acorns, and, I joke that we have a ranch here. It's the berry farm, right? Because it's just all these Native American, berries. And so, how do you get an ecosystem where the majority of the food are human edible, right? I mean, it really speaks to, there had to be just a huge human impact, right? They spent, I say 3,000 years because there's good evidence that was sort of the consistent, human culture here. There was a fairly consistent culture for 3,000 years. Obviously, they were here much longer. But for 3,000 years, people were selecting plants and, making sure every inch of the state of California was covered with human edible food. And, you can kind of deduce the food system, right? The wetlands had all these foods and fish, and they had a few, elk and deer and things, but mostly they were plant eaters and got their fats and protein from fish, mostly. I mean, that is my speculation. But it's really just the idea that any rocky hillside, can grow edible bulbs and edible seeds and edible greens is really, to me, kind of striking. And but again, you talk to the native plant people. There's a pretty active native plant society in California, and you say, well, it's edible lily that I've been trying to culture. Do you think humans spread the seed? Like, no, it's been here millions of years. Don't talk about humans. And I said, well, you look it up on Wikipedia. It says it showed up around the same time as the Bering Land Strait. Maybe there's a human connection. No. You can't talk about that.
It's just the lack of curiosity. If I was a native plant aficionado and somebody who was an active land manager approached me and said, first of all, the plant you're cultivating is rare at this point. So I would shake your hand, first of all, and say, can I come see it and help pollinate or whatever? But there is a particular kind of culture I've seen amongst some of the environmentalist crowd. I've seen it in some places, other places in the West, but in California, it's very pronounced, where it's often a lot of older people and often very self-assured that they're right. And new data and new information is not pursued. It's almost reluctantly accepted. And down in New Mexico, there is, you both may have heard, I think this is news from a year or two ago, but there were a set of footprints found in the white sands that were determined to be 23,000 years old, which is older than any other prior evidence had suggested people were inhabiting that place. And of course, most native tribes say, like, no, seriously, we've been here for a really long time. And I'm noticing that among some younger native folks, there's definitely been a new appreciation for their heritage, and that's often hard won, because to be a Native American in this country has been very hard historically, and there's been a lot of incentive to not identify as that. And a lot of that seems to be around this kind of land tending aspect, the cultural burning, propagating prairie plants. So I'm wondering, what's your relationship like with some of the native tribes in the North Bay area, Northern California? Have you been able to engage anybody on the questions relative to your specific land bases?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm the world's worst networker. So, but
that's why you're on this show right now.
Yeah, we've made a couple sort of tentative efforts and really gotten nowhere. I mean, there's so much trauma in that culture, and there's kind of a mix of sort of lost knowledge and sort of protection
of knowledge, protection of the knowledge that remains sometimes.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been frustrated that you haven't been able to, you know, find engagement there. But it's a really tough thing. I mean, you know, just the trauma that must have happened to these people on the land that we manage is just, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. I mean, it's just terrible.
Yeah, and some may see you, here you're the white new landowner, right? And that is that's a hard thing to get past, those first impressions. It definitely takes time.
Yeah.
It just seems like a
you
lot.
mentioned history. I just read an article about there's a 37,000 year ago date for humans in North America. We found pretty solid butchered mammoths, and it's just there's so much left, so much opportunity to learn about this stuff.
I just think about the cultural or cultural savvy, but in particular logistical communication savvy it would have taken for a group of people to take down a mammoth and butcher it and eat it. I mean, I guess maybe it's possible it died of natural causes and they were fighting off other predators or scavengers to consume it, but even so. And I'm sure you have those moments sometimes of wistfully imagining what the landscape and the people used to look like, and then looking out on the streams that don't carry salmon and the people trying to grow weed in your willow patches. and
yeah.
It's
I
hard.
have actually an interesting sort of story I tell myself about the mammoths. It's like, I sort of imagine I'm a parent trying to feed my kid, and the mammoths are coming through and destroying all the food, once a year. And like, what do I do? And we have a rough skinned newt. It's like it's like super toxic, if you eat it. So I'm like, well, I think I would take one of these rough skinned newts, munch it up and put it inside some mammoth food, and I would just get rid of all the mammoths, right? I mean, we don't know what people did, and they were smart. I mean, they're probably smarter than me, and they knew this stuff better. It's like, it's kind of funny that they joke that these one newt does have enough poison to kill an elephant, right?
Right. It probably was used for such a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could have been. We don't know. I mean, that's one of the things about the culture here, is it was so plant-based and so based on organic materials. It just hasn't left much of a record. And I think that's part of the thing. There's been this 10,000 year number for humans in North America, because I think that's when the Clovis culture came and they started making stone tools. And, before they were maybe using bone tools and things. And so there's just not good, archaeological evidence.
So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about two things. One, give us some examples of some of the successful restoration projects that you've undertaken, how you've approached them, maybe changes in your approach with things you've learned, just some of your tools and techniques and strategies. I know you're pretty handy with an excavator. That's a pretty good tool for larger projects. And then I would also like to talk about some of the legality, the red tape, the barriers that you run into, but all in due time. So tell us a little bit about some of the brass tack stuff that you have learned and things you do.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, it's kind of sobering to, in some ways, some of the stuff's pretty simple. It's also complicated. I had this picture once of a chip fabrication machine. It's a $150 million machine. It's an incredibly complicated piece of technology. And I think, okay, the brains that were, building these kinds of things and building rockets and all this stuff were figuring out how to manage these ecosystems to, feed themselves, right? And so it's sort of this weird contrast of like, well, it's really simple. On the other level, it's really complicated because there's all these complicated interactions. And so, one of the simplest interventions I've had in the creeks is just keep the cattle out, prune the willows, and let the, sedges and grasses grow, and, you get a functional wetland. And you're like, well, if you get in there and stuff some brush in there, you can get it a lot faster. There's one section of creek where, we came here and like, well, it's this incised creek across the meadow, what it used to look like. Clearly, water used to meander around. Like, what, ask the professional, what can we do? I'm like, nothing. Like, wait, nothing? That's not okay. But, you can, spend a decade fencing the cattle out, planting some cattails and things, and you can restore it to function. I think it's still in progress. The other thing is there's really just amazing things you can do with plants and wood in, we'll say upland, upland gully erosion. That's more legal. But really, a lot of my restoration stuff is just really how do you restore these watersheds and reverse the erosion with just plant material. I used to buy rocks and think, okay, I'm gonna put some rocks and stop the erosion. And it's like I got piles of a couple piles of riprap that just I haven't used for 10 years because logs and scoops of sod are just much better technologies for it. And so you can just virtually all our creek restoration, watershed restoration is just focused on one thing, which is getting living plant materials growing in the waterway instead of the waterway running on bare dirt or bedrock. And it's sort of sad because you look at the topsoil 30 feet above the channel and you think, well, okay, it's going to be 5,000 years before it's back there. But still, we can actually at least restore this little scrap of ecosystem in the bottom of the channel of like the actual plants that form the topsoil that fed people here for thousands of years. And so that's really the focus of a lot of the work. And it's just getting sticks and logs and sod to stabilize it, and then getting the right plants to grow, and then protecting the plants and keeping the willows pruned back to do that. And it's sobering because I did the math once. I manage about 900 acres of ranches here in West Sonoma County. And if you spread the population in Sonoma County out over the land, there'd be 450 people on this land. But, our culture can afford, one part-time person to take care of this land. I mean, it's insane. I mean, I think when there were natives on this land, nobody can tell you how many people there were at sort of the peak of the culture. But, I suspect there were probably 100 people, which is way higher than any population estimates. But, there certainly were 20 to 100 people, they were moving around, but sort of, essentially on this land full time, weeding and harvesting, spreading seeds and, managing populations of animals, building fish habitat. And, there's just no replacement for the hands and feet. I use an excavator to sort of, expand my capacity. And I kind of joke, it's about the size and capability of a mammoth. So it's a good tool, even though it runs on diesel. But yeah, it's really a shame that there's not a way to get actual hands and feet and skills. I'm interested in native food. And it'd be neat to sort of actually do the whole process of getting the plants to grow and harvest them and actually create edible food, right? For me, it's just like, well, if I can just get them to grow, at least that's my accomplishment. It's not a one person thing, it's a community thing. And it's sort of, I actually manage the spawning habitat for two different watersheds, steelhead watersheds here in Sonoma County. And they were steelhead in both of them, 5 to 10 years ago. And I think they're never coming back despite my best efforts, right? And it's really a community thing, it's like it has to be a watershed wide thing, and there's just no mechanism to have that happen.
So if you could wave a wand and have the response from the community and the powers that be, the academics, the agencies, to restore steelhead, what would that look like? What would the series of actions be?
To some extent, I don't know, because one of the key things is actually knowledge. You got to, invest to build the knowledge of how you really create better habitat. And it's like, but we could run water out of a stock pond, and you say a gallon a minute of water in the dry season is enough to keep the steelhead alive in a creek. We could pipe a spring to the creek. We could, restore the water storage in the uplands with, these BDA kinds of projects, and, getting plants growing in there. So instead of running off quickly, a really simple thing I did, there's a sedimentation pond on one of the ranches. And, it's like, I mentioned these large lakes. And well, how do people build these? And I thought, well, if I was going to do it, I would actually just plant a bunch of cattails and tules at sort of the outlet of the valley, and then I would dump some dirt on it every year, and eventually I'll have a pretty self-sustaining dam. I mean, probably more complicated than that, but so well, we'll try that. So put some cattails at the spillway of this pond, and think, well, if the cattails, grow and raise the water level of the pond 6 inches, that's whatever, I forget the number, but 500,000 gallons of water that's going to gradually trickle through these cattail roots and be there for the steelhead downstream. It's probably just a couple weeks of flow, but you do that enough times, maybe you can create the habitat back. All that said, I mean, I'm actually kind of skeptical, because I thought, oh, this spring I could pipe it down to the creek and maybe protect the steelhead, but for years I measured the spring and it would run at 2 gallons a minute in late summer. In June this year it was running at less than a gallon a minute. So it is even worth trying to pipe it down there, because as the weather gets hotter and drier, it's just these aquifers aren't getting recharged.
So you are seeing aspects of climate change that are affecting the range of actions that are even available or worthwhile for you to take.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a really good example, because climate change so often seems like something so big and abstract, but the way that it impacts, we always talk about feedback loops in the sense of like ocean currents or jet streams or permafrost melting, that kind of thing. But what you're talking about is a potentially feedback loop on a very local level that can have large and emergent ramifications from there. If your very local spring is not flowing adequately to where there's no water going into the headwaters of the steelhead habitat, that just thinking about the role that fish play in so many other food webs, that's a pretty significant change.
Yeah, I mean, the loss of salmon in California dooms the redwoods. I mean, dooms the whole ecosystem, because the nutrients that they brought up from the ocean into these plant systems were critical for maintaining the soil fertility. And it'll take, 1,000 years, but eventually the soil will just become less fertile, and all the trees will shrink because there's just not enough nutrients there.
Yeah, phosphorus in particular, right? So my earlier question about what kind of changes in the culture and agencies, it was a little bit broader than piping water. I'm curious, if someone came to you and said, John, we're desperate here, you've been right all along, we're looking to you to understand what it is that we need to change, what kind of support do you need from us, your broader community, what would be your wish list?
Well, at a really high level, I mean, if I had the magic wand, what I would do is I would say we need to shift our beliefs around ecosystems from our model of reduction of harm to that people can actually, people are responsible for playing an active, positive role, and it's possible. I mean, it's just so heartbreaking, this idea like, oh, people can't be trusted, they'll just destroy it. It's like, well, no, people who are part of an economic system that says they will starve to death if they don't destroy the ecosystem, will destroy the ecosystems. But actually, humans like healthy ecosystems, I think. And so, like, if we could actually, bring that belief that people have a role, can be a positive impact, and that would be the key thing. And then, underneath that, there's all kinds of tactical things of like, well, let's learn about the food plants, and maybe we don't eat them because maybe they're so much less productive than our European food plants, but there's important lessons there. And so much of what we can do to adapt to climate change is about managing watersheds. And we need to store more water on the landscape. There's millions of gallons of water that the land that I manage used to store that it no longer stores because of these incised creeks. And that's good for everything. It increases the productivity, increases food, reduces fire risk. Just it's a no-brainer, but it's mostly illegal. The other thing is well, I mean, the two of the big threats with climate change, well, three. One is, loss of plants, so storing more water, and is good. The other is fire, and again, storing more water is good. And then the third is, I mean, obviously we have issues with flooding, and so can we, manage these watersheds so they're resilient to, more intense rainfall events? And just the nature of the land I manage, they're small watersheds. There's not really users of the water downstream, and there's not like houses in the floodplain or things. It's just ripe for learning about how to restore the water storage capacity of these systems, but there's no energy for it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that might change as climate change makes and other just whether it be maybe it's energy, maybe it's food crisis, where people can no longer kind of take their current life support systems for granted, and they desperately start seeking alternatives, and they hear about this kind of regenerative land management, and a lot of people get inspired and want to become land managers. I guess if you're being on your hopeful day, do you think that kind of biophysical pressures might eventually push people in that direction? Whether it's going to be too late or not is a whole other thing. Whether it's beyond repair, as we've been talking about. I mean, that's kind of in the conversations we have in this podcast. A lot of it is very much in line with what you're talking about, that humans can play a positive role. We need to play a positive role, and but the doomer optimism. So the doom is like, well, it's not happening, things are getting worse. And so where does the optimism come from? And most of the time what we come up with is, well, it'll have to happen once humans are forced to wake up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like a harsh theory of change, right? Because all of a sudden, people no longer have access to water, people are hungry, it's very harsh. We wish we could be more proactive about it, but I just,
yeah, and we are seeing that in California. There is work on fire, fuel management for fires, and it's positive, and a little bit of the healthy landscapes creep into it. People talk about, oh, I'm going to thin out my forest, and I'm going to stuff the stuff in a gully to mitigate erosion at the same time. It's a challenge though, because that work tends to be such low social status. They talk about, oh yeah, I had a group of a dozen vineyard workers come in and use machetes to clear the understory, and it cost $2,400 an acre. We paid $15, right? And it's not the way you're going to get a lot of deep thinking and experience. You got to up the social status of that role. Mm-hmm. The other place we see it where that pattern is happening is with the fish. I think there's a whole industry of fish managers, hatcheries, and things in California, and they've their job depends on there being fish. If the fish go extinct, they're out of work. And it's kind of my sense is, I'm not a fisheries expert, but my sense is they're kind of slow to react. But you do see this little glimmer of light with the beaver, embracing beaver and embracing beaver dam analogs, where we'll go into these upland mountain meadows where it's not going to hurt anything, and we're going to restore the water storage capacity. And so yes, I think it will happen. It's frustrating that it's so much damage needs to occur before it does happen.
Right. And the longer it takes, as we were saying, the more it becomes irrecoverable, at least in kind of human timescales, or, once you lose, once you lose a fish species, or, you lose something and it takes thousands of years to come back, you've lost your opportunity. So that's where the frustration, I'm sure, comes in.
Yeah.
I feel like I could speak briefly to sort of a extreme end of what a lot of California is experiencing, which is our lease in New Mexico runs towards the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which is the very southern end of the Rocky Mountains. sort of an eastern fork. And
I grew up in Taos, by the way, so.
oh, that's right. Yeah. So, yeah. So Mora County and around there, Mora and San Miguel counties. And as I'm sure you both know, there was that huge fire, about 350,000 acres, and it kind of burned, sort of side hilled a lot of those mountains. And there's lots of old Spanish communities in there. I mean, people who are 8-10 generation deep, basically speak a different dialect of Spanish because they've been there that long, right? And so that all burned, and some of those burns were so severe the entire ecosystem is permanently changed, at least on human timescale. And I have friends whose homes barely survived the fire, but they have been flooded out about 8 times now. People whose homes did not burn now have been literally washed away from the just unchecked water, right? The soils are hydrophobic. They can't absorb the rain, and we've had an average monsoon season there. So we're okay on our lease because we're a few miles away from the burn, but those watersheds are seriously suffering. And there's been a big call to action for just people to volunteer, experts and volunteers, to do a lot of wattles and check dams and weirs and more kind of more progressive strategies too that we're of course learning about. But those are really poor communities. The fire was barely reported on in the news, and the flooding is barely reported on. And of course in California, fires kill dozens of people at a time sometimes. So it's the news cycle's fast and vicious and leaves a lot out. But just to John's point, there are real humanitarian emergencies that come on the heels of this abandonment of common sense land management, but there's not the money or the social cachet around responding to that. And I think it's interesting because, firefighters get a lot of thanks, and rightfully so. Wildland firefighting is brutal, but a lot of the work that has to be done is that more slow kind of land tending. And it's a real shame that a lot of us have to function as sort of ecological martyrs to address some of the most urgent needs of our time that are so plainly obvious that they need to be done. And I'm kind of a doomer in that respect there. I'm trying to understand how to build that social cachet around it, and how to make the case to the federal government if need be to just throw more money at it. I'm not too proud for that.
Okay, let me ask you, Ariel, maybe you, Jonathan, as well. What kind of social institutions do you think would be most conducive to that? I'm thinking in terms of how, like, ownership structures of the land, whether it's a bunch of enlightened private landowners, whether it's managed as a commons, as public lands. Like, how do you have ideas about, what would be more conducive, to regenerative land management and getting a lot more people in the land, in a way that's also sustaining of people, people's life.
I'd love to hear from John first, if only because then it'll give me more time.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, I think, I own a lot of land, and I consider it a significant responsibility, and I'm incredibly frustrated that I'm not able to do as much as I think that the land deserves. And, I think, well, maybe somebody else could, but I look around and like, wow, maybe there's one nonprofit in the area that does a little bit more than I do, but, it's like, there's just not much happening. So there's tremendous opportunities to do more. I don't know what the right structure is. I think the key thing for me is just the economics and the social status around it. We have a road that passes through our ranch to a little subdivision of, upper middle class neighbors. And, my social, I'm sort of this weird guy because I go out there and build my own fence, and I'm also the landowner, and it's a very mixed energy, right? You'd think, the community would celebrate that because my fence and my land management is increasing their property values because they're driving through a beautiful landscape instead of a vineyard or a pot grow. But it's almost, I would have higher social status by, buying a fancy Tesla than I would by improving the health of the landscape, right? So I think the ownership structures are important, but I think it's really the first thing is this values of, is the land important, and is somebody who's taking care of the land, performing an economically, useful function. And it's, you see a lot of these alternative ownership structures and they really struggle. And it's just, when you have an economic system that, persecutes people, it's tough. We bought a second ranch in Sonoma County and met the neighbors, and we go over and meet the neighbors. And the first thing we get to their house, and he's like, I got a thing I want to show you. And he pulls out this laminated, 1910 or something newspaper article. He's like, yeah, somebody was remodeling the house on the ranch you bought, and they found this in the floorboards. And it's like a story about a dairyman who went to that house and killed himself because he lost his ranch. I mean, it's like, that's what the neighbor was saying. It's like, okay, you got your big ideas, you new guy coming in, this world is brutal. And, and it is, right? You got to acknowledge that the penalty for taking good care of the land is starvation and death and losing your land. I mean, and that's the culture we live in, right? So, I think there are all kinds of opportunities with ownership structure, but if taking good care of the land is dependent on sort of a philanthropic, goodness of individuals, we're just not going to get there. It's got to be a culture-wide energy.
Yeah. What before you go, Ariel, just wanted to bring up. I mean, there's a whole kind of movement called regenerative finance. We interviewed Gregory Loungua, who's co-founder of the Regen Network, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. Right. So they pay for, right now it's mainly carbon markets, but eventually they want to move to other ecosystem services, water cycles, and biodiversity. And he's pretty optimistic that it's going to catch on. Of course, it's his job to be optimistic. And I'm wondering, and eventually he sees like the whole monetary system being based on like ecological health. It'll have to, and that'll kind of change the whole status and monetary incentivization around good land management. I'm wondering if you're familiar with that stuff at all, and if you think it's interesting, or you just think no, not really.
I mean, anything is, I'm happy to learn about any possibilities. We have carbon farm plans for our ranches with the idea that, okay, we'll write this carbon farm plan and we'll get a grant, and we'll, be able to take better care of the land. Well, it turns out, California's coastal service soils have relatively high carbon content. It's kind of the nature. But ours has been going down, right? Because hotter, drier summers and less fog reduce the carbon content of the soil. It doesn't matter what kind of grazing we do. And so, trying to have a very specific financial model around storing carbon in the soil, right? It's not going to work. I mean, just like, storing carbon in the forest is going to get wrecked by the fires. I mean, so a lot of these financial structures, they're too focused on one thing. And I'm very cautious about anything that's sort of financializing nature. I mean, it's just really problematic. And I don't know what the answer is, but I haven't seen anything there that like, I think that's gonna work. But I'm open to the possibility. We did our carbon farm plan, and we applied for a grant, $250,000 grant from the state of California to plant woody vegetation in a riparian zone. It's not what I wanted to do, but I'll play along because I want to support the local jobs, and I want to have people to work with instead of just working by myself. But to get this grant, we also had to apply for a $9,000 grant from the NRCS to match the state grant. It'll give you a better chance. So we got the $9,000 grant from the NRCS, but not the $250,000 grant from the state. So we were legally obligated to do the restoration work without the money. And if we said no, we owe the government money for their wasted time in giving us the grant. We were able to get out of it because it was a drought, but that's how challenging these systems are. Like it's like, okay, planting woody vegetation along the creek doesn't bring the steelhead back. It's just they're not flexible to meet the needs and understand the needs.
Yeah, but I agree with a lot of John's sentiments about the trappings of financial, trying to solve the ecological problems with financial instruments. I don't understand a lot of, I'd like to learn a lot more about, like crypto and what Gregory's doing. I need to listen to that episode. I've talked to him a little bit and know him in person, but I'm a slow learner, so it takes me a while to wrap my head around that kind of stuff.
Well, kind of that episode, we're all kind of the stodgy skeptics. So you
nice.
maybe you'll like that. Is like we're like, well, kind of the concerns that you brought up, John, of financializing things and Goodhart's law. What becomes, I forget how to say it, but there's just all kinds of adverse incentives associated with that. But anyway, go ahead, Ariel.
Oh, yeah. And at the same time, I do feel like we are in at the very least, a total biodiversity crisis, climate crisis for sure. But I would emphasize the things that are products of just bad land management. And honestly, a lot of it's just simply land conversion, just loss of habitat. So that's what I'm pretty passionate about on the habitat that is within my influence, which is so-called working lands or in ranch lands. There's a company I learned about recently called Pivotal that is exciting to me because they are really innovating, I think sounds pretty effectively, on biodiversity assessments and indexes. They're not part of a market yet, but they are trying to work on the back end to make sure that as markets emerge around biodiversity, I mean, it sounds kind of yucky to talk about, I realize, but at the same time, it's hard to say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But I'm willing to kind of play ball with that for now, I guess. And so long as mining companies, for example, are able to buy credits that don't mean anything, let's make sure they actually do mean something. Whether that greases the wheels of further industrialization of the planet, I don't know. The older I get, the less interested I am in arguments made from principles, and I'm more interested in what actually works, and kind of, as John was saying, reverse engineering, trying to infer the principles from what we see. And human nature kept within the checks and balances of the individual cultures and communities and plant and animal communities, we know can be really beneficial to our landscapes. Human nature writ large and stripped of those constraints can be extremely detrimental. And it seems to me that we are a species that likes widgets and tokens. We don't like doing something and not getting any credit. That's the value of some of these really absurd and arbitrary class signifiers, like what's on someone's wine cellar. They have something to show and talk about and bond and communicate over. And there's nothing inherently bad about that. It just so happens that a lot of the things that we that function that way are derived of really destructive practices, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I lived in Sonoma County long enough to be really cynical and about the kind of like crunchy Whole Foods purist who talks about, it's like that Portlandia joke, like can I see the chicken's file? Did it put its little wing around its friend? And I worked in small, in some ways, small scale food production since I was 17. So I understand the cynicism around all that. And at the same time, I think if we can replace people's tokens of culture and status with things that are genuinely supporting regeneration, that is worth exploring. I am very sensitive to things that indicate someone is supporting regeneration in name only, and thereby precludes their supporting it in fact and substance. And that tension is really hard for me to sort out. That makes sense. So often the signifier becomes a stand-in that prohibits growth, prohibits something better coming along.
I just want to, I'd forgotten exactly what Goodhart's law was, but it's when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. And we threw that at Gregory, and he, we threw a lot of skepticism at him, and he had good answers, good sounding answers. I'm not qualified to really assess it. But Ariel, I wanted to. We had an interaction a while back, a couple years ago. I was talking about. I had a tweet of like, thinking of like, small farms and homesteads being kind of a good basis of society, and you responded about, you would emphasize kind of the commons and cooperatives, and I'm wondering in light of like my previous question about ownership structures, I don't know, do you have thoughts about that, so whatever the financial incentive structures are in terms of just how we manage land, like, who has access to land when, and all of that stuff. Do you have anything else to add on that part?
I'm not sure I have anything I maybe thought I had more answers at the time than I think I do now. The landscape that I'm on in New Mexico is interesting because it used to be part of a huge land grant that was grazed collectively in a commons by poor Spanish families. As I understand it, essentially kind of a feudal system, frankly, where there was a sort of an elite family who allowed these people to live and graze on their land. And it's curious. I mean, that's a pretty huge ranch, and there's very few of us there, and yet you can see the signs of human life, from petroglyphs to more recent graves to rock corrals. I mean, it's obvious that it used to support more people than, in terms of more people's livelihoods, than it does now. And I say that because it's I know that there's people who've devoted their careers to establishing models of commons that take into account human nature. I just don't know what those are, but I am dubious of the sort of small scale, small community solves everything kind of model, partly because I know for me personally, that's not available to me. I'm basically a working class grazer, and I rub shoulders with people who are not, but it ultimately, my options from an ownership perspective are limited. And I think a lot of the conversation about solving the food system has been dominated by people who are middle class and above, or upper middle class and above, and don't leave a lot of on ramps for people who are making practitioner or manager wages. Maybe, we partner on some cattle, but that, as anybody who owns cattle knows, that's no guarantee of much wealth. So I would have to say, well, there is one model I know a little bit about that comes to mind that was, to me, seemed functional from what I know about it. And that was called the Crown Commons maybe in Alberta, somewhere in Canada. And it was a multi-use place that hosted grazing associations. It allowed, had a lot of provisions for Indigenous tribes to practice their cultural life ways, hunting, gathering, maybe burning, I don't know. Basically what our public land should function as, but it sounds like it was more functional and everybody was fairly happy. And unfortunately, it essentially became privatized and began to much more resemble the BLM or Forest Service allotment system, where it's one producer with a relatively small amount of land that they had more grazing control of, versus places that are grazed in association. I'm interested in commons models that do not involve someone's entire life. So commons that can be kind of codified in working agreements and business agreements that are separate from, and we all raise our kids together and we cook dinner together twice a week and that kind of thing. Because from what I've witnessed, that is where the manure can hit the proverbial fan, because it's just too personal, and I don't like spending that much time with people. Obviously, my time with horses, dogs, cows, and elk. So that's a long way of saying not really, but I'm interested, I guess, in commons models that are able to separate the kind of human, homely lifestyle piece out of the livelihood piece as sort of a matter of course. I'd be interested in hearing whatever you have to say, John, because I know that you've you want to find ways to involve more people, but not in a way that's bound to fail with all the social trappings that go with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think just it's not, to me, it's the ownership structure is obviously important, but there's so many barriers beyond that. And so particularly like with food production, cattle, I mean, the idea that one producer needs to be able to feed 100 or hundreds of people is just not going to be a cooperative model there, right? It's too diffuse, right? If one person's feeding 5 or 10 people, you can kind of have a community in a model. But you don't. I've sort of dreamt about a commons model on the ranch we have that's a steelhead spawning habitat for Bodega Bay, which is a little fishing town. How would you get people together to say, let's all work together to get steelhead back in Bodega Bay? Maybe they're there on a different ranch, but they're certainly gone from my ranch because it dries up every summer for the last few years. But I have trouble imagining it, right? I mean, there should be a sense of ownership. I mean, the fish, everybody owns the fish. Everybody, has a right to the fish, and that's part of the problem too, right? If I could sell the fish that spawn, return to my ranch, then maybe I could, raise the money to take care of the creek. And I don't think that's the right model, but basically all the paths are blocked in our current model, other than just, sort of depending on, government grants, which, in our area don't care about steelhead, right? They're about the hatcheries and the commercial salmon species.
I kind of get to thinking that maybe the transition, I think a lot of what John's describing is just work that is an imminent and inevitable. I mean, not imminent, it's long overdue. It's inevitable and necessary to support life systems, even locally, just like water, stuff like that, water or surviving fire, etc. And I'm not sure what mechanisms exist to preemptively get enough people to care in the right way. There's various ones that work to some degree, even if it's just simple nonprofit tax write-off, nonprofit donation. But I think as these externalized costs become internalized, honestly, I think a big part of the change is just going to be those of us who live in first world countries, so to speak, learning to accept what is often deemed a lower standard of living. It doesn't have to be experientially a lower standard of living, of course, provided people are well fed and are not impoverished. But it might be that a certain class and a few generations of people realize they aren't entitled to taking European vacations every year, or to flying all over the world even if it's for their job, right? And I wonder if, as people are looking for replacement joys and replacement status, if there is a way to have some of this work, these tasks, be there to receive people as they look for that significance. And I am seeing some hopeful indications of that direction. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have a lot of money, can fly anywhere they want, and they choose to go stay at guest ranches and move cattle around, even if they don't, even if everybody knows they're not actually helping. For them, it's something meaningful. And anybody that I take out to help me move rocks and spadefuls of grass plugs just loves it. They all love it. I've never had anyone say this is beneath me, And
that's like my definition of a good time. I mean, I try and portray in like my social media presence, just the amount of satisfaction there is in interacting with ecology and producing food and these things.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is we have to, so much of that has become people's personal brand of like radical environmentalism. Mm-hmm. Something I'm navigating in my own sort of trying to understand my own place at the like wetlands plus working lands equation is, how do we talk about and demonstrate this stuff as just being practical for producers and not something that, you get tattoos of, or you like bless the creek with poetry before you start, like less precious, because I just think that humans we really are into coding things. And some of the trouble John has had is people don't know how to code him. You know, is he the big white landowner, or is he the hippie guy down getting muddy in the creek? You know, people don't know how to. And so I think if we can have, I don't know if that means more categories for this kinds of work or just no categories, not trying to brand it as radical acts of reciprocity, or however it is that people like to frame it in language, and just have it be available for everybody as a human thing, irrespective of culture. Maybe that's a place to go.
Well, I think we should wrap up soon. We've been going for about 90 minutes, but I guess we usually, we usually let the guest kind of, they have any kind of final word, anything that they wish had been asked, or any, whatever they want to finish with. And maybe, I know, Ariel, you're kind of co-host, or you're a main host, but if both of you have one final word. What you just said, Ariel,
I've said my piece. I'd love to hear from John.
Okay. So Jonathan, is there anything in this conversation that you think we've missed, or that you want to emphasize?
No, it was a great conversation. I mean, I think as far as emphasizing, I just say, it's like, the optimism, for me is like, there is so much we could do, right? And there's just opportunities everywhere. I mean, the reason that, a core reason that I own land is I, used to go hiking around in the parks and think, wow, wouldn't it be cool if I could plant a tree, or, get rid of an invasive thing? I wanted a deeper relationship with the land. And then I think, if we just get more people who are interested in sort of connecting with the land and learning what they can eat, and, sort of understanding that, people can play a positive role. There's so much possibility there. Let's do it.
Nice. Well, I think what both of you said is a great way to end up. So thank you. Thought this was great.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this, Ariel. And hopefully this will come out in 2 or 3 weeks or so. That's kind of our schedule right now.
That's fast. That's great. Is there a way for people to get in touch with John?
Oh yeah, thanks. If for both of you, if people who listen to this and become inspired and want to reach out to either of you, do you encourage that? Some people maybe don't want to be reached out to, but how can they reach you, and how can they engage?
Sure, I'm happy to engage with people. I mean, I'm fairly active on Instagram, Freestone Ranch, and that's a good way to sort of learn more about what we do. And feel free to comment or direct message me. And we also have a freestoneranch.com website that has a bunch of information. It's a little dated, but yeah, I'm happy to engage with people.
Cool.
Right on. Yeah, same. I'm on Twitter, Greenwood AE. And our website is grassnomads.com, and that has a contact field or email. And I hope that people, part of my motivation for having John as a guest, and thanks, Jason, for having us both, is I think, John, you're at a place where stage is set, and if people can come in and collaborate and help you solve problems in a way that works for your context, that would be a really positive outcome. Hope they get in touch with you.
Yeah, and also just one last thing to throw out. We usually have a kind of a policy that if we have a guest on, then they're qualified to be a host if they ever want to use the platform to host somebody. And I think this counts for you, Ariel, as both guest and host. So if there's other people that you want to host, or Jonathan, if there's somebody out there that you want to have a conversation with, this platform is available. So just okay. I guess let Ariel know, and she can let me know.
All right, thanks.
We have the email too, so cool. All right, well, take care.
All right, guys, have a great night. Thank you.
All right.